Hey, so I'm going to kind of talk about my practice a little bit and then focus on some more recent work that I've done in the last 4 years, I guess. Please excuse me, I'm at the end of an annoying cold, so. But there we go. So I've worked underwater for 16 years now and use it as a space to explore the human condition. I guess I'm interested in thinking about the shifts that happen when we go underwater. It's a space where everything completely changes and that affects the way we relate to our body, and thinking about the psychological implications of this. So thinking about the shifts in sight, sound, breath, movement, every way that we are used to being is kind of shifted. And a thread that's run through my practice for all the time, really, ever since I started doing it, is thinking about these psychological implications and using that as a way to explore the human condition. I've worked with freedivers for a long time. When I was on my MA, 2009 to 2011, started working with freedivers because I was really interested in thinking about the breath as a connection between our world and the underwater world. And also thinking about the fact that we can only exist in the underwater world for the duration of our breath hold without aid. So it's a place that we come from, but it's a place that we can't exist in. So just kind of exploring that in lots of different ways and thinking about temporality, I guess, with breath as well. So this idea of our bodily limits being dictated by the length of our breath and this kind of more corporeal temporality that creates. And I also thought a lot about the kind of boundaries and different spaces. So the kind of inner psychological spaces and external spaces. So thinking about it in a kind of psychological way, in a philosophical way, thinking about the geographical boundaries between body and environment, land and sea, and also water and air. So these are all kind of threads, I guess, that I've explored over the years in my work in different ways. This work, for example, is called Surface, and it's looking at the water surface being this boundary. So it's thinking about this boundary between the two worlds and something that's constantly fluctuating, that's always kind of undulating. And so these images are taken. The sitter is underwater, and this is the image that's on the underside of the water surface. So it's in flux. So the kind of distortion is caused by the materiality of water itself. This is an installation view of, I did a residency in Singapore 2012, and we had a show at the ICA there, and this work was all exploring language and thinking about language. There's a book that was really important to me on the MA particularly, called Spell of the Sensuous by a guy called David Abrams, and he talks about language, or like one of the theories of the evolution of language being that it evolved through us echoing sounds around us, like the sounds of nature around us. And so he talks about that being a time where we have a much more symbiotic relationship with nature, and we're a lot more receptive to nature because we were echoing the sounds. And so I was thinking about that in relation to being underwater, when again we lose the ability to speak. And so we have to engage with a more primordial form of communication or form of being. And it was kind of looking at the physicality of speech itself, so thinking about speech and the breath being this thread between two worlds, between our body and the world around us, and water being a space, but due to the density of the space, something that highlights that. So this is just another piece, thinking about the surface of the water. This is like as a camera, it's a freediver going under the kin and breath hold and looking up. So in this work I was kind of looking at the relationship exploring the relationship of the gaze and looking as well. So as we're looking at him underwater, we can see his reflection that's looking back at him, but for him he's lying underwater looking out into the external world. So again, thinking about this relationship between space but also the gaze between a collapse of time as well, I guess. So thinking about our relationship to this image and his relationship to his own image. Skip forward. So this is a piece that was commissioned for House Festival called Aria, and I'll play you a few minutes of this piece. So this was the year that Marina Neudecker was the lead artist, and so the aim of the commission, or the subject of the commission, was to explore the physical and metaphorical boundaries of the environments between air and water and the body and landscape. So for this piece I worked with a freediver and an opera singer, because they were both people who had an acute awareness of breath and used the breath in their practices. And I found two people who had the same body shape, because I was interested in the sort of physical body space and how the air resonates in the body. And we chose a piece of music, which is Du Parc Soupir, which means sigh, and we took all the words out and just reduced it to vowels, and then slowed the piece completely down and accentuated the gaps in between, so she accentuated the breath, so it just became this kind of breath exercise, really. So we did this dry recording, and then used the recording for Liv to then work in the water with. And so the idea is there's a synchronicity of breath, so in the inhale of the freediver is the same time as the inhale of the opera singer, and then the out-breath is movement or the voice. And so there's this kind of synchronicity of breath and the way it's used in these two spaces. And we shot it in a pool that I know of, this pool that's kind of got a square dimensions, really. And so it fitted inside, so this is an installation view inside the shipping container, so the kind of two spaces fitted together. And we used a scrim, which is semi-translucent, so the kind of stripes you can see on the wall is actually the shipping container, so the two spaces kind of came together. So it's thinking again about this idea of spaces and surface, so the spaces of water and air kind of were brought together in that space. So I'll just play the opening few minutes of this. So the piece is installed in the shipping container on our seafront, and the idea is, I guess I was just wanting to use something that you might come across on the seafront, and then you enter this space and find something quite different inside. And the acoustics, so the piece was recorded dry, and then we mixed it in the container using the acoustics of the container. And I was also really like the way, like the shipping container, there's this sense when you're in there, you were kind of immersed in the environment, but you were still aware of the sounds around you, which is a similar thing when you're underwater. You are completely in that space, but you also have this kind of, you're aware of this like very low and very high sounds that are kind of happening around you. So there's this kind of really nice resonance between these two spaces. So I'm now going to jump on to last year, I think it was, yeah. So this is a film that I made that was a commission from Exeter University, an academic at Exeter University, who was doing a project called 2013 to 14 Winter Floods and Policy Change. So it was about the floods that happened in the southwest, the really extreme floods that we had that left many people completely out of home for a long time. And the ground floor of their houses were completely flooded. So basically, Catherine did a whole long series of interviews with people who had been moved out of their homes at the time, and then a year later. And so we went through and found some interviews that we thought might be interesting, and I worked from those interviews to develop this work. So it was thinking about, for these people, this sense of forced adaptation that they had to have into an extraordinary world. So then the normal family home was kind of turned into this really quite weird alien space, and there was a lot of description in the interviews about the kind of acoustics of that space, how it just became something completely alien. This really familiar family home became something that they just couldn't really relate to. And there was also a whole thing about the media. So the media really sort of took hold of the story, and they became the object of public eye, really. And so they're constantly photographed and you know, stories on the news, but they felt completely isolated. So there was this real disjunction between having so much attention, but then feeling completely disjointed and left alone. You know, there was a real, people were very angry really with the way that the whole situation was dealt with. So I'll just play a few minutes of this piece and then talk a bit more about it now. Sorry. There is volume, but I don't know what's happened to it. But basically, what we ended up doing, what I sort of decided to do for the project, was to I managed to convince one of the houses that had been flooded to let us in and kind of re-flood the house by bringing trays of water in and filming the house through the reflection in the water surface. And I thought, sorry, I don't know what's happened to the sound, but anyway, the sound kind of describes what's happening. Like in this piece, there's a helicopter that's circulating the room, and then you go into another room, and it's kind of the radio that's kind of, there's quite a famous speech about the government saying how much they're going to do, and they didn't do anything about it. But the idea is that the camera is this kind of like disembodied eye that roams around this. It's not one house, it kind of keeps turning in on itself, just going through these different rooms, kind of like Ash's house that kind of keeps falling in upon itself. And as you kind of go through, it becomes more and less distorted with the water. So it's this kind of comment. I guess it was just really kind of wanting to explore this relationship between, kind of how they were feeling this idea of it being completely disconnected and disassociated with this very familiar home and with the rest of the country. So this is how we shot it, by bringing in these big trays of water into the rooms and then kind of having this camera on a run that kind of like moved around the house. Sorry. And then this is moving on to just some work that I made end of last year in residency in New York. And this is called Passage, and it's basically some stuff that I shot in Sardinia in a cave that summer, I think. And it kind of came together when I was on the residency, because there was a sound artist who was also on the residency, who was amazing, who works with sound, but he kind of works with micro, and works with water a lot. And so I basically shot this cave and really, really wanted to do something with it, because it was this really amazing passage, this really amazing underwater corridor, but I kind of was trying to find, a way of using it. And then started hearing John's sounds that he kind of makes. So I'm going to start playing it and talk over everything. But this is the way John makes his sounds. So he sticks a hydrophone in water. And we actually brought out, I got Angus, my husband, to bring out some rock from here, from some chalk from the coast, and made the soundscape. So the soundscape that you can hear is the sound of the oxygen releasing on this tiny scale in this into the water. So I was just thinking about this idea of scale, and also just like Henri Lefebvre talks about temporality and how we experience temporality in relation to our own bodies, and so how we perceive the movement of time is always in relation to our own temporality. And it was just thinking about how these kind of rocks are always moving, like everything's always moving and always shifting and always responding to its environment, but it's just on a scale that we don't see because we're seeing it in relation to our own body. But they kind of put in that, just thinking about that in relation to the micro and how this kind of oxygen is kind of expanding with these rocks in the water. Yeah, sorry, I don't know what in here in a bit. So the work was kind of projected, so I had the photographs installed in the corridor, and then the film was projected onto the photograph, so you had the still and the moving together, and then the kind of soundscape. And then this was some other work that I made whilst I was out there as well, and this is called Frontiers, which I basically found this quarry in Pennsylvania to film in, and was just kind of really interested in these objects that were there in the quarry. And it was at the time where there was China with there was this argument over land. It was kind of thinking about land, and the words called like frontiers, because it was just thinking about the fact that we've kind of discovered all the land that there is to discover. And I was also looking into sonar mapping, which I'm kind of continuing to do at the moment, because there's a huge underwater mapping going on, and people are starting to kind of define or trying to redefine their continental shelves. And just thinking, I was just thinking about this, and with China, with this, there was an argument over some land, like this island, and just thinking about these ideas of frontiers and the fact that we can't discover any more new land above water anymore, which is just quite interesting, and the fact that underwater there's all this territory that's still to be undiscovered, and that we're now starting to fight over, basically. So that was the kind of ideas we took behind these. So this is going on to another piece. This is one of the works that I made this year, which is a commission from Opera North, and it's called The Water Sinks Down With Them, and they basically did a touring production of Wagner's Ring Cycle, and asked me to make an audiovisual installation to go with the work. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Ring Cycle, but it's like the most epic opera ever. And it's 16 hours long and took him 21 years to write. And he had a theatre specifically built for it, so it's quite epic. And I decided, after a lot of research, because I didn't know the piece at all, and a lot of thought, decided to kind of almost react, I guess, to the epic scale of the opera by making a piece that was focusing on the opening few bars. And I mean, probably why they asked me to do it, but he does, like Wagner does, open and close the opera in water, so it's opened in the River Rhine. And the prelude sets the scene for the whole opera, obviously. So in the prelude, water is kind of a metaphor for the evolution of life, and also this journey from a kind of pre-conscious, more instinctive, animalistic being, which is Albrecht, who then takes in this first few, in the prelude, he sees the ring, he decides to take it, and that's this conscious decision. So he goes from a more instinctive being to a conscious being, I guess. And Wagner kind of talks about in his notes about how that actually the burdens that come with that, with this idea of conscious thinking rather than being a more animal, instinctive being. And he talks about one of the things I became really interested in actually in all the stage notes more than anything. They were really quite amazing descriptions, but he talks about the water being a timeless, unending yet ever-changing cosmos, and the Rhine providing the fundamental rhythmic pulse of nature, which was really, just thought was really lovely. So I basically ended up, again, shot quite a lot of stuff, and then ended up focusing on filming a very tiny drop of salt water down a microscope in 4K, and basically made a 6-hour piece out of one take of this tiny drop of water going from liquid to solid state. Because I was thinking about salt water in terms of human, the salt water in the oceans, tears, that kind of thing. So it's kind of something that we have within us all, and is within all the earth. And with the work, the kind of thinking about it, finding it again, like kind of finding a cosmos, I guess, in a tiny, tiny drop. So these are just some of the sketches, images that I made on the way. And this is John, whose shed I spent a long time in making this, and this is his microscope. And we basically, what was just really amazing. So this is like my camera set up, and we were shooting 4K tethered to this screen, and we got so mentally obsessed with the lighting that we were like lighting something that was so tiny, but got really specific with it. But what was I going to say? What was really amazing and what was really important with the piece was like we spent all this time getting really obsessed by it, but then once you set that drop off, it just unfolded. The thing just kind of took over itself, and you just let it go. And that was kind of part of what we were really focusing on, and what we did with the sound as well in the opera, because it was thinking about the idea of time before humans existed. The cosmos is, the universe existed way before us, and we're a tiny pinprick in this, and the fact that everything. So that's just more pictures, and then this is the sound. So it's amazing designer Nicolas Becker, who Philip Perreno show at the Tate opened today, and this is his sound designer. So he's quite amazing, and I worked with him in Paris for a week for this. And we decided we recorded the Rhine Maidens that are in the Opera North's production, and again focusing on his opening few bars. So he starts with this triad B flat that starts from nothing. It's really amazing. So the opera starts completely in the dark from nothing, and then slowly builds, and then it kind of morphs into the first word. So it starts with the orchestra, and then it kind of turns into the first words spoken of the opera by the Rhine Maidens. So we just focused on this triad of E flat and asked the Rhine Maidens to sing it in lots and lots of different ways. We got quite playful with it. And we decided very early on that the only human presence in the opera was going to, in the piece, was going to be through the voice. And again, thinking about this kind of the autonomy of the image or of the sound, we made the sound on this loop. We ended up composing it in a very, very organic way. Because the image and sound are on their own loop, so they're not directly related at all. They're kind of they start on a certain trajectory, and then they just kind of get further and further apart. And also, so this is as we're installing it in the South Bank, and we put a false floor in as well again. So in Wagner's theatre, it's quite amazing. The orchestra are below the seats, so they're hidden, and the sound just emulates that from underneath. So we kind of wanted to use some of that with where we installed this by putting transducers on the floor. So we were talking about the verticality of sound quite a lot when we were building it, or talking about the design of it. So we had kind of the voices, the high voices coming from above, and then we had the other sounds resonating from below. And then this is it. It toured with the opera, so like to the towns where it was going to. When it was at the South Bank, it was there, and then we had it in Leeds Central Library when it was in there where it started. I can't remember the name of the place. And then in Newcastle, it was at the Sage, and so it had a room at the Baltic. So we completely changed the installation when it was at the Baltic, because we had this much bigger room, and we could. It was when we were composing the sound, we were kind of playing with moving the voices around, so you could kind of move the bodies around physically in the way that you can hear it. So we kind of spaced the speakers out, so you could hear that a lot more when you're in this space. That's a very pixelated iPhone picture. Anyway, I'm going to play you a bit of that. Are we all right time-wise if I play a bit of that?
So,
Yeah?
yeah.
Cool. Because you kind of got to see all the way through. So this is one take. Yeah.
So, any questions for Emma?
Yeah, I've got one. I just wanted to know, it's just really, when you showed the container, with the swimmer, the diver within,
Yes.
was that upside down?
Yes. She was, yes.
That was a fragment of a longer film?
That was,
A
yes.
Small, yeah.
Yes.
How long was the actual?
8 minutes?
Okay.
Yeah.
And the one you just shown, how long is that?
That was, I meant to say, that's 10 minutes, and we made, we did 6 different journeys over that one drop of water, so we made an hour out of that. So that was shot in 4K, but shown in 2K, so that we could, in post-production, we could move over that drop of water in 6 different ways, so 6 journeys over that drop of water. So we made an hour out of that.
And this piece?
This is for the stuff that I'm showing here. This is the wreck that I filmed that I was going to talk about, but I feel like I've run out of time.
I think.
No, it's fine. No, I need to put that up so you didn't just see my desktop, because it's like dirty laundry, isn't it? Just seeing someone's desktop.
All the dodgy stuff.
Yeah. So I just thought I'd put something else. We can look at something else, but yeah.
Emma, do you want to say your show at the King's House?
Yes, so I'm in a show at King's House as part of the Photo Fringe with Helen Cammack and Tess Hurrell. And should I just briefly, the work that I made was commissioned for B-Side Festival, and I also did a residency, and Helen did the same one actually in Barbados. We were there together in February. So both of the works that are in that film room, we made some of the work in, part of the footage was shot on the same residency in Barbados, which is quite nice.
Barbados.
Yeah.
They have great artist residencies.
Don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah. Right, so I think we should all say thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here in Brighton. I was going to take the time really to just talk through the work that's in the Fringe. So it's one body of work, but the work kind of shifts between mediums, and there's an overarching title which is called The Reluctant Mute. So I'll just kind of talk through the work as it comes up on the screen. So my practice, it sits kind of at the intersection between photography and sculpture at the moment. I'm also bringing in some text as well. You'll see this kind of develop through the series. So this piece here is called Folding In, and it's a form of cameraless photography. So I was interested in going back to the medium and the fundamental properties of photography, be it light, time, and photographic chemistry. And the work is thinking about that idea of the mute, the idea of self-censorship. And for this piece, every time I made a fold in the darkroom, I exposed the paper. So the paper is slowly shrinking, reducing down in size. And then when it's unfolded and processed, it comes out with this kind of very particular pattern, a pattern that I couldn't foresee before I made it, but it became a pattern I got to know quite regularly, because I did make 3 of this one piece, so I kind of knew what to expect in the end. And I see the work as a form of self-censorship within that, so every time the paper is folded on top of itself, it's acting as a self-censor. I like to think of the enlarger light kind of as a metaphor for speech. So it's a way of sort of showing that the speech is kind of coded in the work, yet it's still unravelled, it's still unable to be deciphered. And this kind of came from, it was a period of time when I was doing a lot of writing about speech, about language, and I was also attending psychotherapy sessions, and I was really interested in the use of time within that session. So you're given 50 minutes, it's the same time every week, and you kind of have to either use the time to your advantage by getting out everything you want to say, or if you're reluctant to speak, it's kind of this time that will still exist, and it feels like it expands kind of as you're sitting there. And it felt like a kind of a power struggle between me in psychotherapy and the psychotherapist, because he wasn't engaging with me, he would just sort of sit and let me talk. So I was like, I like the kind of parallels to photography, the use of time and the agency of time and the control of time. It's something I was really kind of thinking about when I was making this. And all the work I make kind of plays on this limitation of language and this limitation of verbal speech. This particular piece I sort of kept in with the idea of a limitation and a physical limitation in this sense. So the size of the image is actually my wingspan. So it's quite a big piece to make in the dark room. So it felt kind of very performative, and I kind of see this as a relic of that performance, physically scrambling over the paper to fold it. And fibre paper is quite tough, it's quite rigid, it's quite difficult to manipulate. So it was quite a long process in terms of the physical folding. I think it took me about an hour and a half just to fold the image, and then a further half an hour or so just to expose it. So it was very bodily, very much about control, and yet with that little sort of hint of chance that I would get absolutely nothing at the end. And the installation, just an installation shot of the work, to further the idea of the physical and the folding and the print. The image wasn't flattened, there was no glass in front either. I didn't want to make it kind of difficult to reach, because the work is all about touch in language, so it's kind of available to be touched, although no one dared touch it. Yeah. So that kind of acted as a catalyst for the next group of images. So these are all called sun sculptures, and they're all smaller prints, they're a bit more about the hand. And I went back to more of a sort of documentary photography mentality, in that I photographed, so I folded photographic paper outside, and then I photographed the process of the paper slowly changing to the light. So I'm playing on the idea of the sun print, but because they're little sculptures, I call them sun sculptures. So they're very much about sort of the agency of light and time, and I kind of see them as a key to the last piece folding in, which is a lot more abstract. It's kind of, for me, allows a little bit of access into that more abstracted piece. So there's 5 of these images. I haven't showed them all at once yet. I'm not really sure whether that's necessary, but I'll show them all today. Within the work, I mean, all the work's about this different tonality of the grey and sort of the weight of something. So the shadow becomes part of the sculpture, which wouldn't be possible if I hadn't photographed it. It would have shifted as the time the sun moved around the room. So it was about sort of containing that within the image, and also the transformation that an image can do, and transformation of the photograph. And then this body of work, it came about after I spent about 5 months intensively writing. I was on my MA at the time, so I was writing my dissertation, and the text started to shift into the work at the same time. And the thesis actually shares the same title. It's also called The Reluctant Mute. And within this image here, the mantelpiece, it's quite a banal image. I was interested in the hierarchy between text and visual language. So the text and the image, so this is one print, it's one Silver Gentleman print. So the text is encompassing the same physical space as the image. in the idea of shifting between text and image. Both of the images, I guess, they're both descriptive, yet neither kind of give you more than the other. They're both kind of containing something and not being able to sort of penetrate through the image or penetrate through the text. I'll just give you a minute to read the text. So within that body of writing, I was actually visiting a friend who's on residency in Paris at the time, and we'd been out to party, cycling home, and I unfortunately had a cycling accident which resulted in me breaking my jaw. So I was writing all about language and the limitations of language and that idea of mutism, but less of a physical act of mutism. I was more interested in this kind of self-consciousness or this inability to actually express oneself. But then this sort of extra layer came into the work where I broke my lower jaw kind of clean off, both sides, the lower mandible. And there was a really interesting sort of situation that arose from that. So I was in Paris. I don't speak French. My friend spoke very minimal French. The paramedics who came didn't speak English. I physically was struggling to speak anyway. My jaw was kind of interesting. I've never broken a bone before, but my jaw was really heavy and kind of loose, but I expected the opposite when you break it. So they were trying to communicate with me, and then I was trying to communicate through my friend who was trying to communicate back to them. So it became this kind of messy situation where no one really knew what was happening or knew how to really communicate with one another. And then eventually I think we ended up using text to write. So I was trying to write in English to my friend because I couldn't physically speak, and then he was trying to translate that. So it was all this kind of really quite a ridiculous, absurd situation, which I did find quite amusing, but obviously I was very kind of in another world at that point because of the pain. And then as a result of breaking my jaw, they wired my mouth shut for 6 weeks. So I had really attractive braces across a space of 6 weeks, which was pretty horrendous, but also really interesting when I was writing about this anyway. So it was this really strange life following art kind of situation. So I ended up actually, one of the chapters in this thesis became about breaking my jaw and the absurdity of it, in talking about this physical restraint, this inability to talk, which sat alongside this kind of emotional inability to express oneself. So that's kind of this just strange situation I thought was quite interesting to bring back into the work. And kind of back to this image, I was writing a lot about so the language, the text and the image, and I was reading a lot of Susan Stewart's writing at the time, and Barthes writing about image and language and text and language. And there's this really beautiful part talking about Barthes kind of describes the physicality of the handwriting, and looking at handwriting, how it's a way to link back to kind of deep memory and this the physicalness and the uniqueness of the hand and the writing. So which kind of came through in the text, talking about the description of the letters, so the incompleteness of the O's and A's and the curls linking the Y to the F's, sort of trying to describe an image without ever giving you the image, without ever really revealing what's been said. And then this piece, which is called Habitual Labour, this is really where the kind of sculptural form developed a lot more in the work. So there's multiple layers going on within the image. I was looking at William Morris prints at the time, and I was interested in his ethos towards labour. He was quite interesting in the fact that he wanted everything to be accessible for the everyman, yet his production was so expensive because everything was handmade and everyone was so skilled and everything was about this craft and this uniqueness. He actually made it impossible to align the both together. So I just thought he's quite an interesting character. And obviously his work is very much sited within the home. And then this piece was kind of playing with the idea of repetition as a way of kind of dealing with trauma, or also as a way that prevents you from actually dealing with something. So Habitual Labour kind of became the title for this work. So the print was a 10-metre darkroom print, which it's a continuous print. So I did a lot of work kind of playing around in screen printing at that point, and I tried to use a similar method. So the image was projected and then the paper was moved across and kind of hidden in a box, and this image kind of repeating itself, and then it falls off the page at the end. So because I'm doing this in the dark room, obviously the image doesn't develop through until you've actually processed the paper. There's a lot of slips within the image, so whether the pattern overlaps, doesn't line up, and slips away. So it's this kind of hint at the physicality of the making. In the scale of the image was playing upon this limitation again, so looking at limitations of language and limitations of photography. So the roll size was 10 metres that I was using, so I just used the whole roll, sort of trying to stay within these constraints in a way, which is also how I think about like the self-censorship and the language. It's all about these particular constraints. So this one took a while to make. It was a small section of a pattern that was actually on a silver, so it was a fabric. You can't really see the detail on this image, but you can see the detail of the threads in the actual print. Then I manipulated that and reappropriated it within the darkroom, making a smaller print, which was folded. Then I flipped the neg a few times, so I managed to make this kind of mirror image of itself. So when you see the folds actually on the print, that's the folds of kind of the paper negative that I created. So it's really laid and really laboured after. And then that was rephotographed and then used as a negative for this piece. So the work is very much about labour, and the darkroom is a site of production. And then I decided to make these steel little U-bars as a way of propping the print up. But it also was used as a drying rack for the paper. So the image was made and then carried over to the site and then laid over the steel and left to dry. And that kind of, it was a really amazing room that the work was in, because the light was creating these really incredible shadows around the image. And the physicalness of the work kind of falls back into the physicalness of the making. Just see if there's anything else I want to say about it. Oh yeah, so the creases, the projected creases and the folds, they kind of become a representation of themselves as they come through in the image. So it's this idea of the repeated pattern as this, I guess, way of dealing with something. the last image. It's another installation shot. So this one I named Habitual Liberty, because it's a similar idea of this repetition and this pattern making as a way of dealing with something that language can't access, or this deep trauma, deep memory. So it's, I don't remember how many panels it is, 15 panels of wrapping paper that has been folded similar to the first image I showed you, to create these kind of floor tiles which were then just sat together. So it's very similar idea as the last print, but less about labour and more using light as a transcription and as pattern making. So bring it all the way back again to these fundamental properties of photography and of the photographic image. And a lot of the work I was thinking about while I was making all of these darkening works, it's kind of performance artists from the 70s who use their body and the limitations of their body. And I was looking at a lot of minimalist sculptors. I actually was on residency for part of my last year in New York, and I managed to go to David Beacon, and it's just such an incredible, inspiring place to go. There's so many amazing works that I never expected to actually get to see in real life. So that definitely had an influence upon the work. And I think it's probably most notable in this piece here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Are the artworks themselves colourful, or because these are black and white photos
Yeah.
of the art? Are they?
No, they're in black and white. Yeah, they're made in the black and white darkroom.
Okay.
It was kind of a decision that was almost made for me in terms of the production of the work. But it's something I'm considering how it would come across in colour. But I thought black and white actually works better with this idea, because colour becomes more about colour, and for me it was about pattern, and it was kind of stripping it back, keeping it within this kind of very simple fundamental principles of photography.
I'm sort of confused. Nice piece, but it's framed, so this is a picture of a picture. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is installation shot. Yeah.
All right.
It was easier to kind of show how I wanted the work to be seen in this installation shot, just because I thought that one of the most important parts was that fold coming out in the middle.
No, I mean, I'm a screen printer in another life,
Okay.
a digital artist,
Yeah.
and I do quite a lot with origami.
Yeah.
But I will actually maybe scan a bit, maybe manipulate them, but I would never dream of taking a photograph of it. I don't know, maybe I should. I don't know. And they're all in colour as well. So.
I see.
There's amazing coloured papers in origami.
Really.
Which is what you were talking about, really.
Oh, I see. That makes sense. Yeah, an installation shot was kind of, I was trying to show the scale because it's quite a big image, so I couldn't scan.
And what size is it?
So it's my wingspan, so it's 157 centimetres.
Oh.
Yeah, it's really physical.
It doesn't come across it in the slide, by any means.
It's strange actually, my work. I don't think, I'm sure a lot of artists feel this way, but you don't really get a sense of it until you actually see the physical image, and because I'm playing more with sculpture and sort of this hybrid between the two mediums, it's definitely more interesting. Or
they become sculptural forms, really, don't they?
Yeah, and it's kind of playing with that.
And they could be aluminium or anything, really.
Yeah, this amazing artist who uses aluminium, sort of bends aluminium, and then she magnets photographic prints onto it, so the prints sort of sit in this shape, which is really, really interesting. It's not what I do, but it's really great.
Steph, with the sun sculptures,
Yeah.
how did you present them in your degree show?
So the sun sculptures are really small. I wanted them to be the most photographic, the most obviously photographic, which is something when you're in an institution and when you're in a department, you kind of lose sight that other people don't have access to that information. So the more abstract pieces like this one and the habitual labour, no one really recognised them as photographs. So I wanted to try and kind of bring them back into the photographic language. So they were quite classically framed, like museum glass, kind of shrined photograph, kept quite that little.
Yeah. I mean, and I ask because Dana shows, you know, she's hand printed most of the prints except the really large one in the exhibition, just here in the main gallery. And, you know, for her, the sense of scale is very important in terms of photographic history and, you know, keeping it within that tradition, but also the intimacy of that scale.
Yeah.
You know, and scale becomes very important in photography because it can be anything and it's totally up to the artist to choose how big something becomes. But then it's to do with it becomes a bodily relationship. So this is incredibly different if it's that scale to something that's something that you've just folded in a piece of A4 paper, say, which it could also be if you didn't have the dimensions down there.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was, I'm glad you said that because the small pieces, they were more about the hand, whereas this felt more about this physical performance, my whole body, because I use my whole body to make it, so it had to sort of reflect that within the work. So I find as I'm making work, a lot of the decisions are kind of made for me in that sense, and I kind of let the work go off and sort of exist in the way that seems the most appropriate for the whatever I'm trying to portray or hide.
And is there a return kind of to a wish to grapple with the photographic in a way that has been erased by the flatness of digital, you know, and going back to that materiality of the image on the print and the darkroom, and the mystery of the darkroom and the mystery of the chemical process.
Yeah, definitely. They're all the things that excite me the most about photography.
Yeah.
So, I feel like there's a resurgence, so it's coming back.
Right, yeah, absolutely. and you've been working with Metro Imaging, and Dana has just had that experience of having her work framed by them, but also that large print, which she'd never had professionally scanned, and so she was able to work on the scan and then make this beautiful print. And you've been mentored as well, so has that opened your eyes to different techniques of photography?
He's a really passionate, really interesting guy. I think he's trying to loosen me out of. I kind of I'm very similar to my work. I do work in constrictions, and I think constrictively, but it's a way to sort of, I don't know, kind of, the joy of the making is so important to my work and so integral to how I work. So kind of trying to figure out how Metro plays within that, because I find it very difficult to hand something over to someone else.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they also have an amazing direct to medium printer there, which might be something I could play with. But yeah, we'll see.
Dana Aria is going to be doing a discussion with Steve McLeod, who's the director of Metro Imaging, about printing on the 30th of October, if anyone's interested. I hope you can come down.
Yeah, that'd be great, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, why do you see the kind of relationship between craft and art? Because you brought in repetition, it makes me think of a patchwork quilt on the floor, and you've got William Morris and the repeat printing. I mean, do you see it as the Paul Labour of art, or do you think that they interlink? Or, because I feel a bit of both going on in what you're doing tonight.
Yeah, definitely. The craft is something that I'm really interested in. And I see it's similar to darkroom practice. I mean, you sort of understand your materials more the more you use of it. I think it's about the uniqueness, and craft sort of plays with that as well. And it's almost like a small club. It's something that isn't as widely spread. You get a certain amount of people who are so passionate about one thing. And my experience of the darkroom in that sense is very similar. You're in this kind of almost a cling for tradition, but I'm trying to shift it in a way that feels a bit more contemporary now within the work. But there's definitely a relationship between that, especially Morris and his ethos and his whole revolution of making is definitely something I think about a lot.
I think because you're a hands-on photographic practitioner, the craft skills are necessary for the artwork.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So, can I ask about the idle curiosity, 20-metre print? How did you process it? Did you use a mop and bucket?
So it was a sorry, it's 10 metre, 20. To be honest, I feel like once you've done 10, you could do 20. It was incredible. We actually had to set up a backdrop holder at the top of the sink, and we filled the sink we had 70 litres of developer, and then it was like a performance in itself. I actually filmed some of it, and we pulled it. Yeah, we pulled it across and dropped it in, and then rolled across. So the sink, I think, is maybe 2 metres. So it was kind of very back-breaking work. You had to move it from one side across the other. I had one person helping me, so it wasn't as crazy, but it took us the exposing of the image took 2.5 hours, and then the processing took, I think, another 2 hours by the time we did everything. And we had to set up all the chemistry before. We only had one sink, so we filled it, and we had to dump all the chemistry, lift the print out, wash the sink out, and then we ignored stop because stop was not our friend that day, and then filled it with that fix. And then, but it got to the point where the paper just couldn't handle all the liquid, so some of the edges started to kind of deteriorate and fall away from the image started falling away from the paper, so that was our kind of cue just to stop. And it was extremely heavy.
But that also dictated the folds then in the paper?
Yeah.
Process.
Yeah.
To follow on from that, so you talked a lot about performative elements of your work.
Yeah.
Have you thought, or have you filmed that and shown that as film? Would that become part of your work, or do you do it with an audience?
I'd love to do it as a live thing, because I do think the work has a few elements, but the physical making is very interesting, and it's probably the most accessible. A lot of the other stuff is thoughts in my head, and the physical making, it's something that you can really sort of engage with on many levels. I'd love to do it live. It's just whether anyone would let me do it. It would be incredible. Good idea. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. That sounds great.
Right, any more questions? No, I think that's great. So thank you so much, Steph.
Thank you.